nice to just rehash a bit of the background. Oh, okay, I'll just restart my little segue here. So just before we begin, I think it might be good to just rehash a bit of the background of the event and what we're doing with the speaker series. It came out of two impulses. The first was to open up a platform for researchers studying this important cultural moment between breaking's debut at the Youth Olympic Games and its future at the Paris 2024 Olympic Games. Secondly, we wanted this series to open up a conversation to bring researchers, practitioners, and the general community together to exchange and share their perspectives so we could be in conversation, collaborate, and modulate by thinking through ideas together given the various stances and uptake and different organizations springing up around the globe. We had originally intended it to be a pretty small forum for the exchange of the authors who actually submitted abstracts for a special issue of Global Hip Hop Studies called Breaking in the Olympics, which is going to be published in 2023. So as it was intended to be an opportunity for everyone to share their research and progress, we are really hoping to help everyone involved get a better understanding of this significant moment, identify any blind spots in their research or any missing information that could enhance their research before publication. So please remember that the presenters are in their early days of their research and it's still a practice space for ideas and not the final say. Before we do move on, I'd like to shout out Adam Haupt and Griff Rolofson for giving us the space to explore these, this moment and these issues in the special issue of Global Hip Hop Studies, and for the Cypher Project for their ongoing support of the speaker series. In today's session, we'll be hearing more about the global response to breaking with accounts from the Philippines, Australia, and the US. Before we do get started though, just a couple housekeeping things. It's great to see a massive turnout, and Mary and I encourage everyone to connect and talk to each other in the chat. If you do have a question though, please put a Q just before your question in the chat so Hannah or Mary can field questions between presentations. And of course, if you want to debate ideas and think there's any tension, that's fine, but disagreeing isn't really a big problem. But we just ask that everyone remains open, leave the ego at the door, and we don't want the chat to be overshadowing the presenters. So if it gets too distracting, we may have to turn it off, but let's see how we go. And without further ado, I'll introduce our first presenter, Paolo Bitanga. Paolo has been a B-boy since 2007. And a filmmaker since 2010. His dual passions led him to write and direct several dance films that have been played at festivals like Doc NYC and the Asian American International Film Festival. After working in New York's advertising industry, Paolo returned to his hometown of Manila as a filmmaker and journalist for Rappler, the country's top digital-only news site led by Time Person of the Year, Maria Ressa. He writes original thought pieces on dance for both Rappler and Red Bull. After the Olympic announcement, Paolo co-founded the B-Boy and B-Girl Association of the Philippines in 2021, where he sits as a board member alongside Spy Award winner Carl Dizzy Alba, Red Bull BC1 finalist Erison Mouse Katipon, and members of HipHop International Champions, the Philippine All-Stars. With years of media experience, Paolo uses storytelling to uplift the overall Filipino dance community. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Paolo, aka Paui. Take it away.
Wow, what an intro. Really appreciate that one, Jason. I forgot I sent you all those details. So thanks so much. Thanks so much, Mary, and the rest of the Global Hip Hop Studies team for affording me this space to, as we all do, just share our passions with everyone. So I'm just going to share my presentation here. Optimize for video. There we go. Okay. All right, so hope you can all see that. All right, so my particular research study hopes to present the current Philippine breaking scene as a significant case study for this, not only this global conversation we're having right now about the Olympics, but as you will see, the timeless conversation we and generations before us and generations after us will continue to have about how hip-hop proliferates around the world and evolves, so to speak. Also, before I begin, a little piece of glossary here, if you will. Kuya means older brother in Filipino. If you have Filipino friends, you might have heard of it. Ate meaning older sister. And these words have penetrated into hip hop culture, as we've seen in a lot of, you know, more localized and esoteric hip hop communities to symbolize respect, right? So as we'll see in this presentation, I think it'll be a useful word to anchor us. Okay, so first things first, why the hell do we care about Philippine breaking in the first place? Okay, so at least for the sake of this forum, I think it's first relevant to mention that for those who don't know, at the 2019 Southeast Asian Games hosted in the Philippines, breaking was included. Breaking in very much the same form that we are looking forward to seeing it play out along this Olympic spectrum. So again, co-organized with World Dance Sport, as well as the each national sports body for each participating country. So Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, all these countries brought over B-boys and B-girls to win, multilateral professional sports competition medals, and very much the fourth divergence way that was described by Jonathan Wexler in his piece Breaking for Gold. Now, the Philippines has actually had quite a history of, I guess, pioneering on a regional level or taking concepts from outside of the region into it. So Philippine Airlines, for example, was the first airliner in all of Asia. We also had the first university in Asia back when we were colonized by the Spanish, the University of Santo Tomas. And I think those are important to note, especially given our history of colonization. And I do want to emphasize this this last main bullet point here. We were an American colony occupied for, you know, both on a geographical level, occupied for both, you know, military and trade strategic reasons, and that, you know, until now it still echoes into our current culture, especially when we're talking about hip hop. As you can see, it'll all blend in. And also, you know, defining characteristics of Philippine culture as a whole, we're one of the largest English speaking countries. We're also a nation of seafarers. Even before that, we are an archipelago, so our ancestors are really seafarers by trade. And I guess that how that resonates now is we are a high remittance economy. Most of our GDP comes from overseas workers. And I think it's important to preface any discussion with hip hop, as Jeffrey Lorenzo Pirillo mentions in his piece, preface with this context of a post-colonial nation like the Philippines. So Jason already explained a lot about me, but I would like to say that I myself am a product of that. I am Filipino American. I am a dual citizen. I grew up in the Philippines. I was born in the U.S. Grew up in the Philippines. Lived in New York for 10 years, where I've met a few people in this who are here present and listening to this call right now, and kind of been back and forth between Manila and New York City, which, you know, I think are each significant hubs to be having this to be including this discussion. I represent Solstice and Manila Soul here in the Philippines. In New York, Ginyu Force. I think one of my crewmates, Will, is here. That crew came out of my time in the NYU Breakdance Club, where we organized Breaks You, if you're familiar with that jam. But most of all, even independent of hip hop, but certainly enriched by my years of experience in this community. I am a storyteller. I used to go by the name Fiction. Did a lot of content for Strife TV. By trade, again, I'm a filmmaker. I'm actually returning to Doc NYC this year, actually later this week with my latest film. So excited for that. And I'm a journalist. So overall, as you can tell, I like telling stories, and I like telling stories for topics that are truly dear to me. So a most defining piece 10 years ago was a documentary I made after my freshman year of college when I came back to the Philippines, called Pinoy Bboy. And by the way, this is how I became Kuya Pawi. you know, when you're a filmmaker bringing a film crew into these underexplored neighborhoods and getting people to open up about their passions, you kind of become a kuya to them, even though I was only 20 years old. But what is Pinoy B-Boy about? Pinoy B-Boy, Pinoy being slang for Filipino, Pinoy B-Boy was about two different interpretations of what that term could mean. One being the strong history of the Filipino diaspora, not just in breaking culture, but hip hop culture. I wouldn't be surprised if many people in this call have multiple Filipino B-boys and B-girls among their favorites. Just to name a few, we got, of course, Dizzy, Mouse, Reveal, Remind, Gizmo, Abby Girl, JustFX, Logistics now, Cloud even. Even beyond that, DJ's Qbert, Shortcut, mostly from the West Coast Bay Area scene in the USA, but definitely emblematic of what I mentioned earlier about the seafaring nature of our people, the highly diasporic nature of our people. So I paired that history with what's currently going on with our rather nascent scene here, and the up and coming crews and the up and coming B-boys from whether it's my crew, Solstice, or SAS crew, SAS crew. You might recognize them for making it to the finals at RF Jam and repping at global events. But this all began 10 years ago, and it was the beginning of this sustained ethnography and my identity as a kuya to the scene that raised me. And most importantly, this is where I met Kuya Dizzy and Kuya Mouse. So, okay, the 10 years that have passed since that documentary, I think is fair to refer to as a Pinoy B-Boy renaissance. A lot happened in the scene. I'm going to summarize it really quickly, and I'm going to do so from the dual lenses of this current dichotomy and the initiatives from these two kuyas. So in 2010, my documentary zeroed in and centered on Dizzy's project Pinoys, which brought an all-star crew of both diasporic legends like Dizzy and Reveal, and also emerging stars like the members of Solstice, for the first time to the world stage at the R16 World Finals in Korea, waving the Philippine flag. That was kind of a big bang moment from the scene, because from there, that started not just the exporting of emerging local Filipino b-boys. Again, SAS crew, Solstice, Cash crew, individual b-boys like Alan, Reflex, Hogan, into these larger, more international competitions, and of course, hosting these competitions on our own turf. We had R16 Southeast Asia here. Now I'm just gonna go over here to Mouse's side. At the same time, Mouse had his own little explosion in 2011. If you're familiar with the Not Giving a music video, that's a screenshot from there by Rudimental that went viral about these street kids in the Philippines. It was a narrative. Street kids in the Philippines that got out of gang life through hip hop, and that was very much based on Mouse's life story, which is why he cameos there, and he was a creative consultant there. But Mouse took this narrative to practice, really, and he came back again and again to the Philippines, as Dizzy did. He passed down his learnings from being a member of MZK, disciple, so to speak, of the Universal Zulu Nation, formed Zulu Pilipinas with a bunch of local crews, including SAS crew, and then started organizations like Hip Hop for Hope, Kapayapaan Project, which brought international b-boys like Katsu, as well as NASA from Australia, into the more secluded areas, whether in the streets or in the provinces of the Philippines, to educate the most at-risk youth in both hip hop education and formal skills. So, really, they were teaching these kids math, but in order to draw the kids, they would teach them dance. And Kapayapaan Project is still going strong until this day. Mouse ultimately joined the crew that he formed those projects with, SAS crew, while Dizzy on this side, along with some members of Solstice, and I guess other upcoming members from around the capital formed Manila Soul in the hopes of building one of the Philippines' first pro B-boy crews. So with that said, before I move on to this slide, to summarize, we have Dizzy on one side and I'm borrowing terms from Jason Ng's thesis, which is the commercialist communitarian dichotomy. Dizzy definitely leans in his initiative leans more towards the former, and Mouse the latter. But I didn't stop there. I asked each of them. I asked Dizzy, what did you call this dichotomy? And he said, pro-minded versus street-minded. And I asked Mouse the same question, and he said, Crazy Legs versus Ken Swift. So I thought that was a nice touch right there. So anyway, now it's 2021. Okay, we are coming out of that supposed renaissance, and right at in the wake of the Olympic announcement. By the way, this is an op-ed that I wrote all about it on Rappler. You can check it out. And as Jason mentioned in my intro, we've taken this opportunity. I'm myself, and I'm an active part of this, to form the B-Boy and B-Girl Association of the Philippines, also known as BBAP. Okay, and by the way, that's just it just so happened that the acronym turned out that way. Dizzy reminded me that boom bap was the original sound that supposedly unified the different hip hop elements. So I thought that was a nice touch as well. This top part is lifted off of our articles of incorporation, but our vision is to organize and unify the Philippine breaking community and all those who support breaking as an art form and professional sport. Again, that's that yin and yang we were talking about earlier. We've reflected that in our leadership structure. Dizzy as president, and he's the director of the competitions committee, so handling all things Olympics and dance sport and competitions related. Mouse as vice president and director of community, with the more maintaining his grassroots leadership there. But we've enforced and bolstered their visions with a balanced board. So I myself, again, I come from Manila Soul. I know the professional side of things as well. We have Luke Lasam and Lamarok, Anthony Lawang from Australia, who both are part of the Kapayapaan Project. And last but not least, very important, and something that I plan to explore a bit more also in the paper, we have members from an adjacent community, which is the, I guess, the street dance choreo performance type community. In fact, we're two-time world champions of the Philippine All-Stars, Madel Enriquez and Lema Diaz, who have extensive backgrounds in the entertainment side of things and the professional side of things, not just domestically, but internationally. So, as Dizzy mentioned when we first formed, the idea is that the Olympics is only the beginning of what we're trying to do, and how we've planned to approach this opportunity. And I'm interested to hear how it's affected your own initiatives, by the way. How we've taken it is this is a catalyst for us to finally jumpstart initiatives and visions that we've long planned on actualizing for years now. Ever since those early Renaissance days, Dizzy's vision hand in hand with Mouse's vision, and finding some synergy there to make it our vision and the true vision of the domestic Philippine community. With regards to my role here in global hip hop studies, my job is simple. I just need to be myself and keep on doing what I do, which is document it. Document a make or break moment in our history in real time. So with that said, I did read Sami Alim's book on Rock the Mic, which highlights this idea of hip hopography, which is a more immersive and an inclusive way of historicizing hip hop culture. These otherwise elusive, first person of accounts, a culture that was so dependent on word of mouth or having to be there, which I feel validates my own participation, my own presence as a practitioner. But it does come with the caveats, right? I do hope to buffer against hypersubjectivity or being too lost in the sauce, so to speak. And I plan to do so in a couple of ways. Well, first of all, Alim emphasizes being constantly being critical interpreters, being self-critical, always understanding your own position in all this. And by the way, going back to what I mentioned earlier about the post-colonial identity, three of the main characters here, Dizzy, Mouse, and myself, we are privileged to be immigrants, to have, I guess, dual identities as B-boys. So it's important to evaluate that position constantly as we continue research and dig up more information from the purely on the ground and domestic side of the Philippine scene. I also hope to, or rather, I am already getting started in interviewing subjects from parallel subcultures and disciplines. So of course, getting to know more of our Southeast Asian neighbors, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, all the countries who participated in our SEA Games and will continue to participate in our our multilateral meets, if you will. And also other sports that have a similar history to us. So we are closely connected with the National Sports Association for skating here in the Philippines, who just had their Olympic debut back in Tokyo. And it's important to take the lessons they've learned and see how they reflect on us. So anyway, I do believe I am hitting close to the end of my time, if not, or rather overlapped it. But I did want to open up the discussion to you. And again, I did say I wanted to present this as a case study for something universal, a microcosm of what I feel that everyone here is going through. So would love to hear your thoughts on all this. Thank you.
Well done, Pao. Thank you so much for that. That was great. Do we have any questions in the chat or any questions from the audience for Pao? Oh, anyone want to ask any questions? Any feedback for Pao in terms of his research? Jaspal, did you want to ask a question? Yep, just unmuting you now.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
we got you.
yes.
Thanks so much, Paolo. Wonderful presentation. I really loved it. So thank you so much for bringing up so many important points. And I just wanted to just a question of understanding. What do you mean by hypersubjectivity? And why do you want to buffer against it? Is it not a good thing? Or, what do you understand as hypersubjectivity in relation to the sort of post-colonial identity that you have described? Thanks.
Well, I guess, yes, I guess it is a little bit of almost like a little bit of a disclaimer, if you will. Given my background, I'm just being transparent here. I'm a creative writer and an artist by trade. So I'm used to telling stories with that flair, I guess. Admittedly, what this global hip hop studies experience opportunity represents to me is it's really my first time in the academic setting, and so I do take that rather seriously, and I know that there are certain boundaries or certain ways that I need to adjust how I present my stories. So that's mostly where that comes from, and again, it's also the idea of I don't think I needed to mention this in my presentation, but it is worth saying outright. I am representing a developing country here. We are definitely a country that needs hip hop in a sense that needs. There are several underserved populations here whose voices need to be heard, and I guess what I'm saying is I need to make sure that not too much of it is my voice. What do you think about that? If you have,
No,
I'm sure you
because
have
yeah,
more
no, thanks.
experience in
No,
this.
because it's the term hypersubjectivity. I'm a linguist, so within
Mm.
linguistics or within sociolinguistics, the term hypersubjectivity means something quite interesting.
Oh
Namely,
yes, okay, please, yes.
I
Go
can
ahead.
share with you a piece by Kira Hall, which actually talks about the Southeast Asian context and the notion of global English within that context, right? And the idea that people in specific places in the Asia Pacific area develop a particular hypersubjectivity towards forms of English, right? First world forms of English, native English language forms. And they're not yet entirely sure which one to use. Should they go for an Australian variety? Should they go for an American variety? And I think it really resonates with the sort of post-colonial hybrid positionality that you occupy, specifically you within the Filipino
how I mentioned
context.
like terms like Filipino terms like kuya have been appropriated into the hip hop vernacular to mean so. Okay, so in that sense, in the purely linguistic sense, hypersubjectivity is perhaps to be embraced and potentially be embraced in this regard. Fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question, Jaspal. We are running a little bit over time, so we might just save, if you have a question for Paolo, just please save it for the end when we have our open discussion, and we'll have some more time at the end to have more questions for the panelists. We might move on to our next one now. Thank you again, Paolo. It was a wonderful presentation. Our next presenters are going to be talking about the Australian, from an Australian perspective. They are Dr. Lucas Marie, who is a practicing breaker and early career academic researcher. His research focuses on the lives, experiences, and expressions of breakers and other styles of hip-hop dance. His work is anthropological in nature, exploring tensions between globalization and localization, processes of social action and exchange, and the culturally specific and contested nature of authenticity. Dr. Rachael Gunn is a practicing breaker and lecturer at Macquarie University, whose research examines the cultural and corporeal politics of breaking. Her work uses autoethnography and cultural theory to understand the structures of power within breaking and hip-hop dance and the potentiality for transgression and transformation. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to you both to get going.
Great. Thanks so much, Jace. B-Boy Earth. Cheers for that intro. Yeah. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Let me know if it doesn't work. Is that all good? Okay, sweet. I'm seeing nods. Yeah. Thanks, Rach. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll give it a start. So, hi everyone. Before Rach and I begin our presentation, we just want to say that we both wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that in which we're both meeting on. For me, in Perth, in the western coast of Australia, it's the Whadjuk people.
And for me, on the northwest of Sydney, it's the Wallamadigal clan of the Darug Nation. Yeah, and we wish to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
Thanks, Rach. So this is a structure of our presentation today. We're going to just begin by introducing our connections and histories with breaking and hip hop culture. We'll then contextualize the Australian breaking scene, followed by introducing our paper for the special issue, like the central questions, research methods, and some of our theoretical framework, like how we're sort of initially thinking about it. And we'll close by sharing some insights into how Australian breakers are responding to and thinking about the Olympics, the WDSF, and the ABA. For those who don't know, the ABA is kind of like the boom bap in the Philippines. It's like it stands for the Australian Breakdancing or Breaking Association. And it's essentially a non-profit. It's run by B-Boy Louis from Sydney, a breaker from Sydney. And the ABA is formed in response to breaking's inclusion in the Paris Olympic Games. This is just like a screenshot of the front page of the ABA's website. And as the national breaking body or national body for breaking in Australia. The ABA has been running lots of competitions, training sessions, and it's developed their own ranking system, which you can see if you want to check it out online. So yeah, we both completed, me and Rach have completed our PhDs, Rach in 2017 and myself in 2019, and published subsequent journal articles, most of which are focused on breaking and hip hop dance cultures. This is, most of our work's been published primarily within the, or written about, sorry, the Australia and Asia Pacific region. Rach having written within the field of cultural studies and myself in cultural anthropology. And so we bring together our two interdisciplinary approaches to work on this project. And yeah, as it's been mentioned before, we're both active practitioners of the dance, and our experience as breakers also heavily informs our research. For me personally, I've been breaking since 1999 when I was 13 years old. I rep Raw and Xerox crew and a few other crews that are sort of dead now. And yeah, I've been active for over 20 years, and I've lived in the UK for a short time, as some of you might be aware of. And I've been to like hundreds of breaking jams across, you know, the US, Europe, and the Asia Pacific region. Rach, do you want to?
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I've been breaking since about 2011, and I rep 143 Liverpool Street Familiar. While this is a Sydney-based crew, many of our members have come from overseas, notably Japan, Korea, but also France, Germany, and Denmark, and many others. And so our experience and our outlook has always been grounded in this international perspective. I've battled all around Australia and been to jams in Japan and Korea. And I've always strived to use my battling and experience to try and grow the Aussie B-girl scene. And that's also been a key part of my research. Okay, so the Australian breaking scene. The Australian breaking scene is marked by distinct, self-determined, localized scenes that are isolated from each other by the geographic expansiveness of this island continent. It's hard to summarize the distinct differences between the scenes in Sydney and Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide, Gold Coast and Perth. Maybe it's to do with the scene's politics, stylistic preferences, histories, and also how they're influenced by the cultural dynamics of each state and city. Now, most of the mixing between the scenes happens at jams once or twice a year, and that's because traveling to another city is no easy feat in Australia. So for example, for me from Sydney, it takes me about 10 hours to drive to a jam in Brisbane or Gold Coast or Melbourne, and about 14 hours to drive to Adelaide. And actually it would take me 42 hours to drive to Perth on the other side of Australia, but 5 hours to fly. So just to get a sense of the scale of Australia. The scene is quite friendly, supportive. Practice spots are open and jams are generally kid-friendly. Sydney is the largest scene, both in terms of breakers and number of comps, which before COVID, there was a jam about once a month. So to survive, many of our smaller scenes are intertwined with the broader street dance scene, and breakers rely more on all-style battles. Our comps are modest. You're definitely not an Australian breaker for the fame or the money. And there's little interest and support provided by corporate sponsors, government, and unfortunately, even the general public. So it's pretty much impossible to make a living from breaking in Australia, with most people fitting it in alongside a full-time job or career. Estimates put our national scene as having about 400 breakers. And so individual breakers, individual crews, individual decisions have a profound impact on the national scene. So our isolation from the major breaking hubs of North America, Asia, and Europe has made it hard for Australia to develop a rep and gain some momentum on the international stage. But a lot of Australian breakers do save up their pennies and make the big trek overseas. They make the journey to New York to learn about the history. They go to freestyle sessions, IBE, Outbreak, and a bit closer to home, they go to Radical Force. But there are just as many Australian breakers where that option is just not financially available to them. And so their understanding of breaking comes from people coming into our scenes, international breakers invited to judge and teach workshops, or even compete against us, as the amazing Destructive Steps comp once facilitated for us. Shout out to Joanne. As well as people who are here on temporary visas or migrated here. Shout out to Poem. Okay. Come on. So, but the Australian breaking scene as a whole captures people who have generally been othered or excluded from mainstream institutions and dominant Australian culture in different ways. So there's a lot of 1.5 and second generation migrants reconnecting with a culture popular in their home or their parents' country. A lot of guys who just want to express themselves through dance and not have their heteromasculinity questioned or pay for 15 years of dance classes. A lot of people who can't afford to participate in the demands of our sporting institutions, people who want to develop their breaking as an art form, and just generally people who want to express themselves and engage in new hierarchies of respect outside the strictures of hegemonic culture. Now, Australia considers itself as a sporting nation, and we take the Olympics and our medal tally very seriously. And so the news of breaking's inclusion in the Olympics was polarizing in Australia, both within and outside the breaking scene. Overlooked sports were fuming at breaking's prioritization by the IOC. There were some very angry squash players. Some Australian Olympic fans thought it was a joke or viewed it as a betrayal. And for many, the Olympics was branded a mockery. So this broader reaction has also shaped the way Australian breakers think and understand their scene and place in broader Australian culture.
Thanks, Rach. So our paper's title is "But Who Gets the Final Word? A Critical Examination of Australian Breakers' Response to the Inclusion of Breaking in the Olympics." Our research methods are primarily ethnographic, qualitative, and we have a few aims, such as, who gets the final say about how breaking should or ought to be expressed, understood, and identified? Will it be the ABA or the WDSF or the IOC, or maybe it will be Red Bull? Who knows? And how, I guess, our Australian breakers responding to the inclusion of their dance being at the Olympics, and reflect on Australia's position also within the global breaking scene, and how might this be transformed or changed. Our theoretical framework is that hip hop and breaking cultures are social fields that are locally reproduced, experienced, and managed. We think that there are no true or natural ways in which to see or experience hip hop culture. One can only make sense of the culture or one's position within it in relation to other positions. In this way, we're contributing to the work of Mitchell and Johnson and other hip hop writers and researchers who've sought to establish and consider hip hop and its various practices as a living, transformative, continually shifting global cultural phenomenon. We argue that hip hop is a diverse and constantly evolving culture with many voices, all of whom are claiming and expressing and making sense of the culture in different ways. With that being said, and what we heard in last month's presentations, it's important to note that there are those who've contributed more to the culture's development, and it's important to acknowledge and articulate hip hop's African American history, its Latin and other POC influences and cultures. These histories have typically been undervalued by the mainstream. However, we contend that we can at the same time respect and promote these histories without making positivist or reductive claims about who is more real in the culture or who is more authentic.
Okay, so I have begun interviewing Australian breakers about their responses to the Olympics. And while many of the responses are probably shared by breakers around the world, there are also many that I think are distinct to the Australian breaking scene. So as I stated earlier, the broader public was pretty angry at breaking's inclusion in the Olympics. And so many Australian breakers are hopeful that once people see breaking in the Olympics and gain more of an understanding of it beyond just people doing the worm at parties, then breakers may gain some more respect and understanding from those outside the scene, so including their family and non-breaking friends. The smallness of our scenes and the struggle sometimes to maintain them means that many breakers see the Olympics as an opportunity to grow our scene, to attract the general public to our events, to help make our scene sustainable, and of course, potentially get more people into breaking. There are also the potential new career opportunities in breaking, ways for people no longer competing to give back to the scene and do something with the knowledge and expertise they've gained from the last 20 odd years breaking. The isolation from big competitions can make it hard for some Australian breakers to stay motivated in their training. And so the Olympics has provided a clear and significant goal for breakers to work towards. And some breakers have noticed that already the level of dancing is increasing. And others have noticed how the Olympics is actually bringing people together with new collaborations across scenes, crews, and even previous rivalries. As a scene that is often left out of regional qualifiers, the Olympics provides Australian breakers with a pathway to compete on the global stage. Yet in saying that, Australia is still getting left out of international conversations and considerations, and the upcoming World Breaking Championships is just the latest example. And so one of the concerns breakers have is that the current global politics of breaking, which is centered around the major hubs of Europe, Asia, and North America, will continue to privilege those scenes and voices and ignore and exclude the breakers outside those hubs.
Yeah, nicely said. Australian breakers are also increasingly concerned about the growing influence and I guess in the embrace of transnational commercial organizations and institutional governing bodies in being able to shape and manage how breaking's practiced, as well as breaking's future. The change in music from our classic breaking canon to this more generic style of beats is normalizing a loss of connection to our collective history. This is part of a broader sanitization of the dance that sits alongside less risk-taking in competitions, with breakers overly penalized for a fumble or a minor crash in their round. Some breakers also see the Olympics as maybe not the worst thing to happen to our scenes, with the Olympics in fact shedding light on the influence of existing transnational institutions on the way breaking is practiced and understood. We've already talked about Red Bull and others, but yeah. There are more conversations around the influence that Red Bull has had over the past 20 years, from normalizing the round-for-round judging system to popularizing the 1v1 competition and the potential effects this has had on crew culture, which in turn has had an impact on fewer breaking specialists like footworkers or, you know, being, I don't know, the guy that just does freezes or hand hops or something. You know, now there's more all-rounded B-boys because that's what's probably going to be judged. No, the judging system favors those types of dancers. So there are concerns around a lack of diversity and individual creativity in breaking, with you know, more stricter or transparent judging systems potentially imposing a kind of checklist for rounds. There are also rules regarding the conditions for judges that also ignore the conditions that the scene and culture has always been organized by. The current rules, as far as we know, is that judges can't be actively competing or teaching, completely goes against the scene's traditions. What's more is that who can become a judge bypasses the scene's cultural hierarchies. People becoming judges who haven't been active in the scene for the past 10 years, and so they may miss important context about the development of moves and trends and bites and whatnot. And people who, I guess, haven't really earned their rep on the floor being judges. In a small scene such as Australia, such top-down decisions can have a significant impact on the social organization of our scene. We've seen like a loss of potential agency, self-determination, and spontaneity for local Australian breakers, which, you know, we think will have profound consequences for the way in which breaking and hip-hop cultures around the world are constantly remade and renegotiated across time and space. Global breaking scenes may become standardized, homogenized, losing their local distinctiveness. And we think that's also a loss in the global breaking kind of collective as well.
There's also the increasing cost to participate in breaking or to even become a judge that may increase the barriers to access. In the Australian context, breaking has always attracted a diversity of people from a broad cross-section of society. And yet breaking's institutionalization from the Olympics may place breaking more firmly within our sporting nations' hegemonic settler colonial structures. Despite the image of multiculturalism we present to outsiders, sport in Australia is largely a middle-class white affair, with institutions structured in a way that privileges and excludes people from particular backgrounds. This occurs through the cost of equipment and uniforms, the club membership fees, the access to facilities, which is not just financial, but geographic in Australia, and the social and cultural capital required for participation and inclusion. So questions around how much will it cost an individual breaker to go to or even watch the Olympics are also things we really need to have conversations about. But there's also a level of indifference about breaking in the Olympics. And some breakers also just see it as another comp like Red Bull that they can register and take part in or not. So we're still in the early stages of our research and our writing, but as more processes and policies and qualifiers get announced, we'll continue to gather the responses from the Australian breakers and think through these questions about who gets the final word on how breaking should or ought to be expressed, understood and identified in the Australian breaking scene. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you both for such a great presentation. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions. If anyone has questions for Lucas or Rachael. Just scanning for hands up if anyone has one. Sarouj. Yep, go for it, Sarouj.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Hope you can hear me. Thank you for the presentations, the earlier one and this one. My question is, like, for both presentations, but obviously this one directed to Rachael and the Australia scene, what's the interaction with the WDSF?
Okay, so so ABA has to kind of work with Dance Sport Australia, who then works with WDSF. So there's many lines of bureaucracy, and that can sometimes lead to issues around communication breakdown and transparency. So yeah, so there is the Australian chapter of WDSF, which is Dance Sport Australia, which is then working with ABA. Does that answer? But that's kind of all I know, to be honest. Like,
thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions for Rachael or Lucas?
Yeah, I have a question as well.
Yeah, Ophelia, please.
Thanks for your presentation. Just a quick question. I'm also preparing a study that I'll do related to the Olympics. I just wanted to ask about logistics. Did you have to take like a permission, or did you just take like ethics from your university and just started on with your study?
Yeah, so I got ethics approval to do interviews, and all my interview participants signed an information and consent form. And yeah, we've started interviews, and I'm still going to do some more interviews.
But no permission from like higher up, like towards WDSF or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
I don't know why I would need,
yeah.
I don't know why we would need their permission to talk about, because it's about the Australian breakers' responses. Yeah.
Okay, if we probably have time for one more question if anyone has an outstanding question. Otherwise, we can move on. You can hold it for later if it's not fully formed. Oh, Mary, did you have a question? I think you're muted.
I've got to unmute myself. Yeah, so I guess I have a question around the critiques around the Olympic, and if you found similar things when companies like Red Bull came in, or kind of the major corporate sponsors came in. Was there a similar critique, or is this seen as a different kind of institutionalization, and yet there's still no critique for companies making a lot of money off of breaking?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think there's always been a critique. You know, it reminds me of the critique when people in the media started calling it breakdancing. You know, there's always this tension, I think, between I don't know, outside institutions and what breaking, like what's actually happening on the ground. And I think Red Bull, we talked a little bit about like the round for round like judging system, but there's always been ways in which these big kind of like UK B-Boy champs or Battle of the Year, like these are all like kind of big institutions that have shaped how breaking's done, and people have kind of like shaped the way in which they start expressing their dance to kind of fit within these events. And I think the Olympics, I guess, is doing a similar thing, and there's different sorts of ways in which it's doing that. I guess we're sort of like our thinking around this is the ways in which, like, you know, local hip hop cultures are quite diverse, and they're quite managed by these like local individuals running jams in local scenes. And the more sort of global ways in which the Olympics sort of kind of enforces from the top down, like how breaking should run at their jams and how it should look like. It just, yeah, it's transforming it in a different sort of way. And yeah, so Red Bull and other companies have done this, but yeah, I feel like the Olympics is doing it maybe in quite a different way.
Okay. Thanks for your questions, everyone. We might have to move on. Please save your questions if you have anything further for Lucas or Rachel for the discussion at the end, where we open up to the audience again. On to our next presenters. We have next up Sherril Dodds, who is a professor of dance at Temple University. Her books include Dance on Screen, Dancing on the Canon, Bodies of Sound, the Oxford Handbook of Dance and Competition, and the Bloomsbury Companion to Dance Studies. She's also an active B-girl in the Philadelphia breaking scene. And Mark Wong, who's passionate about exploring breaking as both an artistic and educational medium. He studied the traditional dance forms for 20 years, competing with battle crew rep styles and performing original theatrical work. Mark is also a co-founder and artistic director of HipHop Fundamentals, a Philadelphia-based dance education company working to empower youth through breaking. And without further ado, take it away.
Thank you. So we'd also like to acknowledge that we reside on the land of the Lenni Lenape. And we also want to give a huge thank you to Mary and Jason for organising this wonderful initiative, and for everyone involved and, folks who've come along today. We're extremely honoured to be here. So today we're going to be thinking about Philadelphia as a vibrant regional hub for breaking, and what happens when the dance becomes a global Olympic spectacle. Based upon other dance forms that have moved into elite competition and corporate-sponsored breaking competitions, we can anticipate something of what breaking will look like on the Olympic stage. When dance migrates from a community practice to a competition framework, the dancing body succumbs to increased regulation and standardization. We see this in current international breaking contests, which feature elite dancers who strategically train for and tactically participate in these events. And although breaking now offers opportunities for professional engagement through performance, teaching, battling, and judging, its presence in the Olympics will award it an unprecedented degree of international visibility, funding and sponsorship, and move towards hyper-athleticism. As breaking transforms into a global spectacle for a mass audience, most of whom will be unfamiliar with its history and culture, we look to Philadelphia as a collectively articulated and self-regulated breaking community to consider what will be erased and no longer legible. For today, we're less concerned about debates as to whether the art of breaking should be reconceived as a sport, or whether this is a good or bad thing for breaking. Instead, we ask, what are the characteristics of a local breaking scene that we value and appreciate? How might these important components of breaking culture become marginalized or disappear as breaking moves to an elite sporting competition? And why does that matter?
So we delicately push past the rocking crowd at the entrance, and we make our way to the lone, tight cipher. This dark atmosphere is heavy and filled with booming bass. Orange light from the bar in the far corner frames the elevated DJ booth, where Scheme, Illiterate, Matt, Frankie, or if we're lucky, even Renegade, stand and bop in their cockpit of records, faders, and buttons. On the small dance floor, heads are down, tucked into the groove, the floor sticky with dried beer. Peering over shoulders, we see the breakers catching wreck in the center, and that's where we're going. Deeper into the underground, that's where all of us will have a chance to leave a trace tonight. So in this space, there's no delineation between competitor, spectator, friend, enemy, dancer, or non-dancer. We pretend to be chill, but really our adrenaline is pumping. Will we make it past the first round? Will we crash? Do we still have what it takes? Let's find out. So this is Philadelphia's second Sunday event, one jam which blends a traditional nightclub space with the underground competitive breaking scene. It's one version of what Ken Swift might call a dark circle, the tight, shadowy spaces which designate the way we break, where creativity and soul are king. Every breaking scene has its own version, and Philadelphia's is particularly funky. What is clear is that the movement of breaking doesn't require an Olympic setting or structure to be at its pinnacle. Many of Philadelphia's breaking spaces breed nuance and rawness because ours is a tight-knit, musically focused scene, which often values funk and soul in movement over execution. But also, these dark circles by nature attract audiences who are primarily dancers themselves, meaning that our spectators are well-informed and educated consumers. So, what will happen when breaking becomes an Olympic presentation before a distant audience rather than a close two-way conversation between center and circumference? What will be lost, hidden, or no longer valued?
I think back to a host of Philly jams and who might participate. Little kids with their spindly footwork through to older folk with their danced memories of breaking back in the day. A spectrum of body shapes and sizes without much concern over an athletic ideal, and a broad social mix from the North Philly neighborhood, local college campuses, or middle-class suburbs. And everyone is welcome to throw down, from the corporate-sponsored world champion B-boy through to a novice crew of B-girls who all do the exact same baby freeze that they learned at their university breaking club. As B-girl Sunny recalls, I've seen people dance with random props. I've seen people who don't do anything that anybody would even really classify as breaking. They just go battle in heels, like whatever it may be. You see such a variety, not only of styles of dance, but body types, and just the mentality and approach that people have to the dance. Local events, you see anything and everything. That's one of the amazing things about it. The ethos of inclusion that Sunny celebrates matters enormously, whereas the Olympic structure will likely breed a homogenized body type, ideal age and skill level. Our local scene holds space for the idea that breaking, even as a form of contest, is accessible regardless of age, background, physicality, and ability. With diversity of participants comes diversity of movement styles and ability. Although word on the street suggests that creativity and musicality will be valued as much as technicality on the Olympic stage, our hunch is that these elite athletes will need to be well-rounded competitors, skilled in polished execution, whose spectacular breaking skills must be visible to a remote global audience. Yet this seems to erase some of the qualities we hold dear in the local scene. For Philly, we think about the B-boys and B-girls who move in compelling and idiosyncratic ways. Flickers of crump, house and party dancers that slip in and out of their rounds. The cypher heads who groove in a suspended display of top rock that magically rides the beat. The B-boy who just loves to head spin and shows up with helmet ready to mesmerize with endless rotations. And those with novice skills who judder, crash, learn and progress each time we see them. As B-boy and host Steve Believe suggests, effort trumps skill. He says, Second Sunday has made it so regardless of how good a person is, it's their connection to the music, and you can see it and feel it even if you're not doing a good job. That's when you get people being like, wow, people who are obviously not skilled being supported by the entire room because we can see that struggle. You trying and failing, but continuing to try is very admirable. I've witnessed breaking ciphers and contests in dark, dingy clubs, in a recreation centre with a grimy smattering of dust across the dance floor, in a wet parking lot, in a shopping centre with a crappy wrinkled floor, in a heated exchange on the sidewalk, and I even managed to get called out on my way home from work last week on a crowded street corner wearing my professor clothes and silly shoes. We imagine that the Olympic platform will offer a capacious, sanitized, and well-resourced performance venue. Therefore, why do we treasure the shitty little spaces where breaking thrives? Being prepared to break in any space, regardless of quality or cleanliness, pushes dancers to carefully select from their arsenal of movement and show flexibility and creativity in the moment. Tight spaces welcome opportunity to showcase nuance and detail, character and soul, qualities that might get lost on the bigger competition stage. And as Steve recalls, we've seen it many times, giant power movers coming into a tiny space and they can't do nothing. The floor's slippery, someone spilled beer, they're done.
So any breaker who says they don't care about what anyone thinks is lying, because we all feel the surge of the crowd. We all surf the same waves. Your crew gassing you up, the hate from your rivals, the genuine love we. How can this intimacy and energy be reproduced by the Olympic audience set back from the performance stage? As B-Girl Sunny said, the local crowd just adds so much energy and hype to a battle. They physically take up space. You feel them, you hear them, you smell them. It just changes everything. And it becomes a community. It's not just a solo or an individual thing, but it's about everybody there. It's not just about the people dancing. You know, everybody is part of the event. So I watched the TV premiere of skateboarding at the Tokyo Olympics, and the absence of vibe in that stadium was apparent, not just because of the lack of spectators due to COVID. The skaters weren't talking to each other that much and they weren't vibing. And the commentators even mentioned that everyone seemed to do better in their practice sessions the day before. So perhaps that was because the day before they were skaters concerned with skating, and on Olympic Day, they were athletes concerned with winning. I've personally felt breaking, particularly in Philly, become more than just win, lose, or draw. I think we all have. Like Sunny said, it's a community, and we're all engaging with the ritual. Hip hop can sample from spirits bigger than itself, from cultural ancestry, the Holy Ghost, the collective subconscious, and breaking embodies that. Of course, this isn't to say that big stage breaking is bad or unimpressive. Rather, the big stage has pushed the limits of athleticism in many ways, and practitioners at times utilize the same strategies which pro athletes use. Like Sunny says, in large competition battles, I just get into a zone. I have no idea what's going on around me. I don't hear anybody. I don't hear anything. I don't see anything, basically. There's so much else that goes into mentally and physically preparing for the next round that I just can't be in the moment, unfortunately. So Sunny defines her competitive zone by its erasures, by what's missing. For better or for worse, there are simply aspects of breaking which are invisibilized, which go unseen and unheard, both for the competitors and the spectators. So the Olympics also brings regulation to breaking, which is traditionally a self-regulated scene with no standardized rule book. The unregulated behaviors which happen all the time in Philly spaces are more exciting than they are disruptive or dangerous. All bets are off in terms of what you wear, what you say, or what you gesture. Genuine beef can play out both within and outside the cipher. Aggressive and non-family friendly tactics are common and encouraged. Real violence is very rare, but disrespect is ubiquitous. In my opinion, true hip hop is always teetering on the edge of possibility. So whether driven by music or the hype of the crowd or sometimes pure luck, you'll see a random breaker stick a move which should be scientifically impossible, or your local hero could get smoked by some unknown suburban upstart, or the Red Bull Dream Team just happens to be in town for the weekend. I've seen someone drag a giant trash can into the center of the floor and walk away like your whole style is garbage. Bright lights of the Olympic platform just won't allow for these moments which live in the shadows of a cipher. Built into the illicit pleasure of breaking is breaking the rules. So historically speaking, it's a youth revolution. Will we be able to keep that respect to this historical context in the Olympics? Like Steve Belief says, the dance came from New York, from people living in a tough situation. And so expressing themselves in this way was a revolutionary movement. Taking it out of that context means that you do lose some of that authenticity and original meaning. The world loves to commercialize everything. So when breaking goes to the Olympics, when people see it on television, we're still going to be contending with this issue of stereotyping it, misunderstanding it, not understanding the cultural context, taking the cultural context way out of perspective, or getting offended by it.
So what can we take from this and why does it matter? The self-regulated values and traditions of a local breaking community will clearly be sanitized for the Olympic stage. The DEY creativity of a city such as Philadelphia and what breaking scholar Imani Kai Johnson characterizes as an outlaw culture will be lost. Her use of the term outlaw is not to reproduce tropes of deviance and criminality amongst its practitioners, but to emphasize the way that early generation breakers created a meaningful existence separate from the norms of a white middle-class mainstream. The desire to push against rules and boundaries within the context of the dance circle has produced a vibrant underground scene. Dance scholar Thomas de France describes how Black bodies have close ties to social dance, and that the dance circle is that which protects and permits. The small-scale cipher honours Africanist sensibilities of showcasing individuality within community. It offers a space that takes care of Black bodies and other bodies of colour, and provides opportunity for self-determination and identity expression. In marked contrast, the Olympic stage values virtuosity, elitism, and the capitalist orientation towards individual success and the desire to win. In de France's terms, it embodies values of whiteness, and its new global television audience will be invited to see breaking through this lens. For us, this marks a serious loss, as the codes and creativity of a local breaking scene will no longer be legible as the dance meets a body of spectatorship unfamiliar with its social and historical roots. This also raises pressing questions of who gains and profits from this commercial endeavour, who does not, and who might never have access and resources to enter this high stakes game. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the great presentation, Metal and Sherril. That was awesome. We have some time for questions. Does anyone have any questions for our presenters on the local Philly scene, the vibes, the tensions? Well, I see one hand up. Is that Ippy?
I just have a comment. I just wanted to say I love just that ethnographic kind of account you gave us of those spaces, and yeah, just a wonderful presentation. That's all I.
Does anyone else have any questions? Were there any questions in the chat? Mary?
Hi, yeah, great presentation. I really enjoyed that as well. This is a question that maybe ties in some of the different presenters, where it seems that there's an argument that the Olympics is going to homogenize the dance. And I'm just thinking back to Sally Baines making the same argument in the early 80s, that the videos were going to homogenize the dance. So this has been kind of an ongoing debate within breaking, and certainly a model that comes from subcultural theory about what happens when outsiders come to a subculture and homogenize dance. So I guess my question for you is, do you see from the flip side any kind of ways in which the origins and authenticity of breaking are already mythologized, and the imagination of what was happening in New York, that where do you see that in the processes, and how are you thinking about homogenizing? Are you thinking about it in terms of aesthetics and form? Sherril, you kind of got into that with saying, well, these top competitors are going to have the same kind of bodies and these, this kind of argument. So where do you see yourself in relationship to those questions of subculture and homogeny, but also in terms of the way in which the scene is already mythologized and people imagine themselves to be authentic when maybe it's up for debate?
Maybe I'll start off, and Metal and anyone else, please feel free to jump in. So yeah, thank you, Mary. That's a great question. And it's one of the things we discussed, but didn't sort of make it into this particular talk. But I think we're really conscious that how we're conceiving Philly, when we're definitely not trying to claim that that's some kind of authentic space that somehow is preserved from, whatever was happening in the Bronx back in the day, and that is its own kind of construction and creation. So we're sort of definitely acknowledging that in itself is a construction that has been self-articulated through the folks who make up that community in Philly. I think some of the ideas about homogenization come a little bit from seeing other dance forms that have gone into competition forums, and I think particularly of some of those ballroom practices. And again, I think, you know, the vernacular spaces are as much a construction as the competition spaces, but it's more quite how drastically the dance changes. So I'm thinking like of what you'd expect to see in a salon or a milonga in Buenos Aires in terms of tango. And then if you think of like competition tango and how the two of them bear such little resemblance, and the kind of diversity of bodies and skill levels that you'd get in a vernacular space, how that differs considerably from kind of the kinds of body and skill level on a competition stage. So I think that's something of what was guiding that thinking. But again, we're constantly looking for the nuance and not trying to be overly reductive in those arguments. Metal, I don't know if you want to jump in with anything on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, something that we talk about a lot is this idea of imaginary spaces, especially like, you know, if you go back to the first jams in the Bronx at 73, like they weren't having brackets. I think that there's definitely a feeling in the scene here when we interview people that yes, the Olympics, there's a fear of homogenization in the Olympics, just because when you look at the Olympics on TV, you see this thing, and then you see the ciphers that actually happen in the dark circles, and you see that they're disparate. I personally think that there's room for both, and I think it was Gunn who talked about maybe one of her interviewees saying like, hey, the Olympics might just be like another big jam that you could enter or not. But it's undoubted that there will be ramifications for better or worse as to how the subculture of breaking is being perceived. But I also think the Olympics will open up a lot of doors too. Yeah, Sherril and I have been very careful not to make it any type of judgment call. It's mostly just seeing what are the interesting erasures that we think might be, that might happen when the Olympic platform takes place, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Were there any other questions outstanding that anyone wanted to ask our final panelists? Just well?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I was just wondering if any of you in your interviews, in your ethnographic research, have, you know, gathered information about the idea of nationalism that is in some ways imposed on to breaking scenes by the Olympics, right? So whereas with Red Bull or something, you don't represent your nation, right? But you are kind of, you represent your crew or yourself or something like that. All of a sudden with the Olympics, it becomes an international event. And given that hip hop has its roots as a sort of, I would even say anti-American or anti-national kind of idea, right? How do you yourself as breakers who might enter the Olympics feel about this, of representing your nation, maybe even having a flag of your nation on your chest or something like that? Or have any of the people you've talked about, and that goes like to all the presenters, I guess, have articulated any ideas about you know, discomfort with representing their nation or singing the anthem or something like that?
Rachael wrote in the chat, representing Australia and possibly winning a gold medal for Australia was something raised by your interview participants. Oh, okay, very cool.
So was that positive, like a positive notion, or was it like sort of?
No, yes, yeah, it was definitely positive. Yeah, I mean, even if they didn't care much about the Olympics, but that opportunity to represent Australia on the Olympic stage and to get a gold medal, it just kind of surpassed a lot of other considerations that might have, yeah, it just was more important. It was definitely seen as positive for some people. Yeah, that nationalism came through in that context.
It's an interesting question as well. I think there's something to do with the Olympic Games always being this resource attracting institution that is like sort of founded on the idea of nationalism and the idea of prestige of the gold medal, you know, this idea of the exchange value of the gold medal becomes this prestigious practice. The awarding of it becomes a prestigious practice that nations are rushing to partake in because of this sort of almost like an imaginary hierarchical system of sporting that, you know, is based on performance, sure, but at the same time, it doesn't really define the value of any of the sporting activity other than you've won the Olympics, and there's an incredible amount of investment coming to your country, perhaps, or, you know, whatever happens in that relationship. It just kind of reminds me of an advance of reinforcing a kind of dominant cultural capital idea or something like that. You know, there is an undercurrent with nationalism that I feel kind of does have that layer that you're talking about, Jaspal, where the idea of dominant class, cultural capital, you know, that whole idea can sort of overlay in some of these circles where we're pitting against each other in this nationalistic framing of representing Australia or Japan or Philippines or, you know, the States. It's interesting. Yeah. Maybe this is a good segue. You know, I think we've all had a lot of questions and everyone's had a lot of thoughts, but maybe we can just open up our discussion so everyone can participate. Feel free to take yourself off of mute and we can all just chat together. You know, I think I think we're sort of at the end of our allotted time. We probably have 15 or 20 minutes where we can have a discussion with the panelists formally. Hi, Roberta, did you want to ask a question?
Hi, thank you. Hello, everybody. I thought that was a very interesting point on nationalism. I wanted just to say a word. I'm in Paris. I'm talking from France. I just wanted to say that that I thought that was a very interesting point, that nationalism will indeed come to the fore at the Olympics. But I think that in any case in France, for as far as I have been able to see, for hip hop dancers in general and breakers in particular, it seems to me that nationality has been an important factor for as long as I can remember, for the past 20 years. For example, when the French break dancers won in 1995 for the first time in an American competition, that was a big deal. And I remember French dancers saying, wow, the French, you know, won a competition in the United States for the first time. And repeatedly when, you know, Korean dancers win, they say, wow, Korean dancers won. And then, I mean, nationality has always been an important factor in defining this or that action or this or that characteristic of a competition or of some event that has come to the fore for break dancers in particular, or hip hop dancers, either in competition or in the cultural manifestation of hip hop dance. So I think nationality has always been an important factor. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you. But it's interesting to underline it, and thank you for talking about it, because we never have actually talked about it, I think, among us. So yeah, thank you.
Maybe I'll jump in there, because I was just thinking, in the chat I said, you know, nationalism really seems to merge with Battle of the Year in the 1990s because people are named with their nation. But I was thinking it goes back even further. Michael Holman was identifying this is an American art form as early as, I think, at least 84. So we have at least some kind of conversation around nationalism that's slowly building, and then I think really comes into the forefront in the 1990s when people start to represent their nation. So it is interesting to think of that in terms of the projects themselves, about how we are building. So Jaspal, thanks for raising that point. It was a really great question.
Can I just jump in with?
I just wanted to. Oh, Epi, you raised your hand first.
Oh, I'll be really quick. I just wanted to say that something that the Olympics is changing, and that, yeah, like UK champs and Battle of the Year also changed, was like, you know, this term of entering, like, I'm not sure if nationalism is important to all breakers in all spaces. Like, a lot of breakers talk about their crews, and a lot of crews are across nation state borders. And, you know, some people rep their crew, the crew is their family compared to their nation state, who may have given up on them or doesn't care about them, or they don't care about, or they may be, you know, belong to a couple of nation states. So yeah, I don't know if nationalism, I mean, it might be expressed like that, and competitions have definitely forced breakers to represent their nation, but whether or not they really give a shit about those nations, I think is a deeper question. And if you talk to breakers on the ground and ask them really what they're repping, I think you'll find a whole host of different reasons, but, you know, nation states isn't, from my experience, one of the big ones. But yeah, just wanted to add that.
It'd be interesting to see how that plays out with newer dancers entering through the lens of breaking in the Olympics being maybe the entryway. You know, I mean, we've discussed the sort of underground versus overground difference in the approach and in the practice and the attraction. So I mean, it could be a really interesting question to investigate further as we sort of progress through the Paris Olympics and into the future, and see how new generations are responding to it. But yeah, anyway, sorry, just my 2 cents.
I just wanted to add specifically in the Olympic context, because it's actually a very fascinating question in the Philippine setting, and I think not to speak on behalf of the entire people yet or anything, but what I will say is the answer might have been different a few months ago. So one thing that was important about 2020 was, I should have mentioned it in my presentation, but the Philippines received its actual first gold Olympic medal with Heidelin Diaz with weightlifting. And prior to that, Philippine sports has had Philippine sports fans have had this, Philippine sports has suffered in terms of the lack of support, which leads to poor performance. And then there's all these things like corruption and whatnot. And a long history of our athletes, some of our best ones representing other countries. Actually, today, our best golfer, Yuka Sasso, just announced that she will be actually taking on a Japanese citizenship and representing Japan. So anyway, to answer your question in the now and here, now that Filipinos realize that we're capable of achieving a gold medal, and seeing how much support Heidelin Diaz got right after she won from both the public and the private sectors, I think anyone who might have been a little more on the fence about it now has something to anchor on, and maybe more concretely sees Olympic opportunities, and that could be a motivator. I was also chatting with Dizzy. Dizzy, did you want to add to that? Because I think Dizzy has some good input on this as well with his experience with R16.
Yeah, well, I actually didn't really have much to say, but I just wanted to add on that at R16 was one of the biggest events. It has the highest viewed battle in breaking history on YouTube, right, with 70 million views or something like that. And R16 from the very beginning was all about nationalism. It was all about because the Koreans, breaking exploded in Korea in the mid-2000s, and it was due to the fact that the government got wind that they were winning all these competitions, and people were flying Korean flags at UK champs and stuff like that. So I do believe that of course, there are countries that, you know, may not agree with nationalism, but then a lot of other countries, especially ones that are like one type of people, they're very much, very proud people, and nationalism to them means a lot.
Thanks, Dizzy. Sherril, did you have something to add, or you had your hand up? I saw.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of add to that bit where we're talking about nationalism, because I think ideas of borders and boundaries are so interesting. And although we've not spoken to many people yet, but what sort of really emerged rather than ideas of nationalism was regionalism. And I think there's still quite a strong sense of affiliation or investment in particular regions. So on the East Coast, sort of on the northeast coast of the US, it seems to really be about sort of Philly, New Jersey, then New York City, and then the sort of DMV region, but also how that's like really an imagined community as well, because I think of how people, like there's a couple of people in Philly who rep crews also out in California, or one of sort of our former B girls who's moved to Atlanta, but like Philly really claims her as their own. So it's quite interesting, I think, the investment in regionalism in some ways more so than nationalism in terms of what we were picking up. Yeah, tri-state represent.
Roberta.
Yeah, I have the impression there are probably many factors. Obviously, you'd have to do a specific research on this theme, but I have the impression there are at least two factors that are to be taken into account. Like one of our friends said, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. Government support, I have the impression is important. Like the Korean government, the French government support hip hop dancers and break dancers. That's an important factor. And I think generation, as one of the, as one person said, crews are multicultural, multinational. That's a recent phenomenon. Like 20 years ago, that wasn't so much the case. So I think generation probably is probably a factor. And so I'd say those two factors are probably important, generation and government support. And I'm sure there are other ones, but those are the two that have come to my mind just now.
Does anyone else have any questions or discussion points, or any questions for any of the presenters about their presentation, their work? I'm kind of interested in, oh, sorry, go for it, Mary.
Jason, I was just going to say we're at 11:30 now, so I'm going to stop the recording so people can have a bit more of an informal conversation. I don't know, yeah, if you want to say any kind of last words, but then we will continue on with the conversation for those that want to.
Sure. Well, just to formally close, I wanted to thank everyone, all of our presenters, for doing such great work and sharing their works in progress with us today. There are 3 amazing accounts of how we're all sort of navigating this new moment and seeing how these sort of uniquely local perspectives are connected to this global phenomena is amazing. And like even some of this discussion around regionalization and globalization and nationalism is so like such good food for thought, really. I'd like to also just thank Mary, my co-host, and Hannah George Wheeler for her help today behind the scenes. We are, of course, going to be running these every month. Look forward to catching everyone there next month, 1st of December. That's our first Wednesday of December. Of course, the registration remains open, so invite more people, invite your friends, invite your crew members, invite, colleagues. We're here to build with everyone, and everyone's included, But yeah, thanks very much for it today. We'll end the recording there, and we can keep talking after.